Thanks so much. And actually, when I received this invitation, for which I am really very grateful and I very appreciate it, an initial reaction was to say, well, Latin America was not there in Bandung. We were not invited. So I should protest. And actually, people, I think it's good to remember Bandung, what it was. So I found this paragraph by Richard Wright, an Afro-American journalist that was there in Bandung. It's very interesting to know. Also, there was an Afro-American member of the American Congress. I have the name somewhere. That was also in Bandung. And he writes in this book, which is called The Color Curtain, which is his report about Bandung. At the times of the Iron Curtain, he is writing about the color curtain. He says, the streets were packed with crowds, and their black and yellow and brown faces looked eagerly at each passing car, their sleek black hair gleaming in the bright sun, their slanted eyes peering intently, hopefully to catch sight of some prime minister, a Yunu, a Chuenlai, or a Nehru. So, would have wanted to be there in that historic moment. And Wright again says that this was history in the making. Lenin had dreamed of a gathering like this, a conglomeration of the world's underdogs. And many Western writers had long predicted the inevitable rise of these nations, but in their wildest intuitive flights, they had never visualized that they would meet together in a common cause. So again, I protest. I want to go to the Colombo group, Indonesia, Burma, Pakistan, Ceylon, that organized the conference and say, hey, how come no Latin America? If color was the criteria, well, you have all colors in Latin America. We have the indigenous population, which we called Indians, because of the big mistake of the Spanish that wanted to go to China, going to the west instead of going to the east, and they thought they were in India. Columbus never actually knew that he had discovered anything. He always, till his death, we joke that he created the first NGO because he was not sure where he was going. He never knew where he had arrived, but he still got funds for a second trip. Anyhow, and we have Afro-American population, we have Chinese along the Pacific coast, millions of Arabs, 4 million Japanese in Sao Paulo, you name it. Indians all along the Caribbean and now in many other countries. So how come, if color is the criteria? I can imagine they would say, hey, this is Afro-Asian. So, sorry. No matter what confusion the Spanish may have had in our map, you are not African or Asian. But interestingly, not all Africans were invited. South Africa was not invited. Not all Asians were invited. Israel was not invited. The Koreans were not invited. None of them. I said, well, don't play the devil's advocate. Any of those countries, if we had invited them, the conference would have collapsed. Our bringing in the contentious cases. And, in a way, if you look twice at what was Latin America in the mid-50s, no matter the color of the population, the elites were absolutely white. The governing elites, they were all and everywhere absolutely white. And that results from deep historical reasons. Now what you have here is a picture representing the Declaration of Independence of Guatemala in 1821. And the actual document, the historic document of the Declaration of Independence of Guatemala, in the first paragraph, says, and I have the quote here, being the independence of the Spanish government the general will of the people, we declare the independence to prevent the consequences which would be dreadful if it was proclaimed by the people itself. And these were the colonial authorities, the church authorities, and so on, and none of the indigenous people that formed and still form 80% of the population of Guatemala were there. If that reminds you of Rhodesia 65, yes, that was the case. In most cases, the elites declared independence so that the people would not declare independence itself. So that there wouldn't be any change. And at that moment, actually, the government of Spain was much more liberal than the governments in Latin America. Very similar situation to that of Zimbabwe, former Rhodesia, in the mid-60s. Only that independence kind of lasted, and those elites remained, and to a large extent still form the core of that oligarchy of which Samir Amin was talking. So it was white governments, even if the people were of multiple colors, and you had the Inter-American Mutual Assistance Treaty signed in 1947, which was the first of a series of military treaties that actually resulted and created the Cold War. Even previous to the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the United States created, on the whole of the Western Hemisphere, without any exception, a military alliance explicitly aimed at fighting communism. So, of course, there was no way that the organizers of Bandung could think of anybody coming from Latin America to invite them. So let's excuse them. I don't protest so much when I look at what the reality was at that time. Interesting thing was that at the very moment when this was happening in 1947, when the Truman Doctrine was proclaimed, starting the Cold War, dividing the world into Soviets and free world, and you are friend or enemy, and there is nothing in between, a third way movement emerged and became very popular and in Latin America among all the intellectual elites and many political leaders of the opposition, that was inspired in some Americans and European thinkers themselves. Henry Wallace, who is a forgotten figure, but was the vice president of Franklin Roosevelt until he died, and could have become president of the US. He lost to Truman in the primaries by a very, very small margin. He was strongly condemning the division of the world in two. And he actually even went to Europe and tried to convince Britain and so on not to join into this kind of alliance. He failed terribly. In France, Léon Blum from the Socialist Party, Jacques Kaiser from what became the Radical Party, which has now practically disappeared, what was powerful at that moment, were talking about the third bloc between the Washington and Moscow, a third bloc. But already, by the end of the year of 1947, Carlos Quijano, an Uruguayan journalist, who was a participant in the 1927 Brussels Conference against colonialism, which Sukarno itself, in the inaugural speech of Bandung, said, this is the president of Bandung, the first ever conference of, in that case, not governments, but activists from around the world. 5 Latin Americans among them. Carlos Quijano, who was one of them, by the end of 47 said the hopes that Western Europe could become a third bloc in the Cold War is lost. There was already at that early stage, Western Europe had surrendered and had basically aligned itself with the US. That hope was lost. And among the factors of why the Latin American third way, although that became a bad name later with, as you know, was not comfortable with the European third bloc, was that France, which was the leading force of that European third bloc that never actually happened, was a colonial power and was doing a war in Algeria against the aspirations for independence of the Algerian people. So we don't want to ally with those guys. Now, for that reason, Latin America was in solitude and could not establish links, not with Western Europe and not with Africa and Asia at that time. And it's interesting that the word solitude is in the title of what are probably the 2 more important Latin American books in this century, or in the previous century, in the 20th century. The Labyrinth of Solitude by Octavio Paz, Mexican poet, who was published in 1950, and 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Now, the Labyrinth of Solitude, Octavio Paz tries to reflect about Mexico and the Mexicans, who we are, where are we going, but that applies probably to all of Latin America. And he comes to the conclusion that the Mexicans are the result of the rape of the Spanish conquistador to the indigenous women. Now here I have an image of Hernán Cortés, the Spanish conquistador, facing the Aztec Empire in what is now Mexico City, at that time Tenochtitlan. At that time, that was a city 3 times bigger than Madrid, 2 times bigger than London. So Europeans had never seen a city that big and that impressive. And Cortés comes with a woman next to him who was his translator, who was his mistress, without whom the conquest could never have happened. No, the Malinche, which is a very interesting historical figure, because actually she was a princess in one of the tribes submitted by the Aztecs. So she was trying to manipulate Cortés to fight against their oppressors while she was being used by the Spanish for their own purposes. But the fact is that symbolically it was a rape, not an alliance. And out of that rape, the child of that rape is the present-day Mexican. And that image persists. So the Japanese cartoon or Japanese reinterpretation of the previous image, so you still have Tenochtitlan in the background, and there you have Cortés, and Cortés is, in this case, treating the little sister to avoid sexual connotations. But it's the same kind of image. Now, the sexual connotation, of course, is there. And according to Octavio Paz, that Mexican born out of that union has love for the mother, but at the same profound shame for she was raped. And he has admiration for the father, but at the same time a profound hate for the violence that was committed. And that generates a very complicated psychology that ends up in denying both and saying, I have no parents. I am, myself, and denying history and not trying to remember because there was a deep shame in that history and its origins. So this is the labyrinth of solitude, and this is why this sense of solitude. In a way, this same idea appears again and again in the 50s. Memni, who wrote about the colonizer and the colonized, finds that same kind of psychology. Frantz Fanon talks about that in Dark Skins, White Masks, that duality intrinsic to the colonial populations. But of course, rape is a moment, even if it has consequences like that child. We shouldn't forget that in history, colonial domination, Spanish domination in Latin America was 300 years, not a moment. So that's an enormous period in history during which cultures and peoples blended and created basically something new. Now, that independence, or that something new that was created, was always threatened by imperialism of the time, the Europeans that made come back. And in the early 19th century, the United States proclaimed the Monroe Doctrine by President Monroe, saying, no, 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 the Western Hemisphere has to be freed of European interventions, and the US will stand against them. Now, at that moment, nobody in Latin America took them seriously. That was said in 1823. And in 1812, the White House itself had been burned by Canadian troops fighting for the British. So they were saying, yeah, thanks, you are going to defend us, but you cannot even defend yourself. So what is that defense means? And basically, the new republics, they all went to Britain to protect them from Spain or Portugal wanting to come back. And in return, they had to accept the neoliberal free trade and opening up their borders to trade. Now, just a few facts of history. That was the map at that time. And the Monroe Doctrine was invoked by the US to say, oh, Texas is being threatened by Europeans. And on that argument, they took it. And in the way, then they went all the way to the Pacific, taking half of Mexico in its march. Again, the Monroe Doctrine was, well, actually, in 1862, Mexico was actually invaded by France. And an emperor was imposed on Mexico. The French brought a prince from Austria, Maximilian, made him emperor of Mexico. And the Mexicans went to the US and said, hey, hey, come defend us. You said here we have this Monroe Doctrine. Basically, the US, sorry, we are in a civil war, we cannot care about that, and didn't say anything. And again, in 1902, Venezuela had all its harbor taken over by the navies of Britain, Italy, and Germany. Why? Because Venezuela was in debt. It defaulted on the debt. It couldn't pay. So the European powers took the harbors, took the custom offices, and said, we stay here, and we take all the revenue until the debt is paid. So Venezuela said to the US, hey, Monroe Doctrine, come defend us. You have here European invaders in our soil. And they said, sorry, if you are irresponsible and you don't pay your debts, we are not going to defend you. And it was from Argentina, Latin American solidarity, that the foreign minister Drago came out with what is now known as the Drago Doctrine that says you cannot invade a country because of a foreign debt default. Good thing, otherwise Europe would be invaded, in these days with all the debt problems that they have. But Latin America was trying to find some legal justification and defense for independence. And when not, it was actually fighting. In 1927, at the moment where in Brussels the anti-colonial activists were gathering to think about how to end colonialism, Sandino, General Sandino, who was fighting the Americans' invasion in Nicaragua, sent a letter to the Congress. And one of the resolutions of that Congress was to support the anti-imperialistic fight in Nicaragua. So anti-imperialism in Latin America basically meant the imperialism of the United States in the continent. Now, that year, 1927, was also the year of the financial crisis, the collapse of Wall Street, the start of the Great Depression, and all those episodes that led finally to the Second World War. Paradoxically, that was a great period for Latin America, because with the crisis and then with the war, the manufacturers from Europe and the US stopped coming in. There was shortage, and the countries had to start to industrialize to just have these goods for themselves. And the so-called import substitution industrialization started, where with the state protecting industry, countries started to produce their own manufactures for internal consumption. They could not compete globally, but it was good for the internal consumption. The interesting thing is that when you start building factories, you start having workers. And there was a new working class emerging, and unions, and a whole model of state-led industrialization with state-supported and encouraged unions and state-protected bourgeoisie emerged and took over all of Latin America. And it produced leaders as Perón in Argentina, Getulio Vargas in Brazil, and many others with different variations, in a way what Samir Amin was calling the social democratic model, but with a strong, productive state at the heart of it. Now, by the moment when we reached Bandung, that model was reached its limit, says Samir Amin. Actually, we don't know whether the limit was reached or not. A limit was placed by the US very dramatically, saying, hey, this thing about supporting unions and this thing about trying to have your own industries and so on, that sounds communist to me. And it was not just the military alliance treaty that was imposed in Latin America in 47. From 49 on, the US started to impose investment agreements demanding equal treatment for American corporations. And after the war reconstruction, not only the US, also European, they wanted to export again their manufactured products, and they wanted to invest in those economies. And they started to see anybody who didn't like that as a communist agent. So in 1954, the government of Guatemala, popularly elected, of Jacobo Arbenz, was overthrown by a coup staged by the CIA and then supported by American troops, which was a dramatic shock all across Latin America. It was the same time when Mossadegh in Iran was overthrown, more or less in a similar way and for the same reasons. And in 1955, Perón was overthrown by a military coup, and that same year, Getúlio Vargas of Brazil committed suicide in the presidential palace because basically a right-wing coup was in the making, and actually by becoming a martyr, he could kind of avoid that kind of right-wing takeover. So precisely in the 50s, the situation was quite tragic in that sense, and it was only in 61, 2 years after the Cuban Revolution, where in the Belgrade Conference that created the non-aligned movement, a Latin American country was present, which was Cuba, the only one. And it took another decade until 1973 in Algiers, when 2 other Latin American countries joined the non-aligned movement, Peru and Chile. So politically, it was a quite slow breaking of that solitude. But interestingly enough, that was also a period where, in economic terms, the notion of development was being imposed. In the case of Latin America, clearly as a preventive counter-revolution. The strategy of the US was to isolate and blockade Cuba on the one hand, and on the other hand to say the conditions that created revolution have to be dealt with, and President Kennedy announced Alliance for Progress. That was the model that later on, in 1973, Robert McNamara in Nairobi, then as president of the World Bank, announced for the whole of the world. And he said, okay, we will eradicate poverty. He promised to eradicate poverty by the end of the century, meaning the end of past century. You know? And at that moment, he set 2 things: the notion of extreme poverty, which was something as a notion that did not exist before. I mean, there was poverty in everywhere and in different varieties. But he said, oh, no, there is one kind of poverty, which is the poverty over there, not the poverty at home, which is worse. And he set a line at 30 cents of a dollar of income a day as the poverty line. Actually, that line, if you adjust for inflation and so on, is much higher than the present $1.25 line. It's closer to a $2 line adjusted. But anyhow, and it was envisaged that a combination of agrarian reform and other social economic reforms at home and aid from abroad would create development. Now, that never happened. First, in the case of Latin America, because agrarian reform never happened, because that dominant class was precisely the class of the landowners, and they wouldn't allow that. So something that did happen in Asia, and all the stories Jomo knows, of course, much better, can tell us about how Asia developed, but it didn't happen in Latin America, that kind of reform. Aid was never important. Nothing of the magnitude of the Marshall Plan for Europe ever happened to Latin America or any other of the third world regions. And worse than all, the trade system was completely skewed against developing countries. So when countries started to say, okay, we will export, we will have our export earnings, and we will use that money to industrialize, develop, and so on, they soon found out that the terms of trade between the commodities being exported and the capital goods being imported was getting worse and worse and worse. So Raúl Prebisch, Argentinian economist who was the head of ECLAC, the UN Economic Commission on Latin America, started to look at the structural causes of underdevelopment. And out of that, with strong Latin American support, came the fight to create UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, saying trade is the key. We need to be able to trade in better terms to develop. And that was a very elementary notion, but around that precisely is that the Group of 77 was created 10 years after Bandung. And then, yes, with strong Latin American participation and input and intellectual contribution, because basically, okay, the non-aligned movement will deal with politics, peace, and so on, which are the tough political issues. The G77 will deal with economics, which is going to have us join all of us together. Now, yeah, so that's Latin America. Problem is that by the same time when the new international economic order was being coined as a term, as a concept, and as a result of that fighting of developing countries, the extreme anti-communism was becoming, and the military alliance was giving a very ugly face to all of Latin America, which was the so-called national security regimes. Now, since 1947, the creation of the Self-Defense Treaty, the message by the US to all of the militaries of the continent was, you don't need to worry, we will defend you from the Russians. If there is atomic war, we will be on your side. You are under our umbrella. The armies kind of felt, yes, but then what is our role? If we outsource our defense to you, we will, run out of a purpose. No, don't worry. Your purpose is to fight communism, but not to fight communism in Russia or in China. That we will fight. Your purpose is to fight communism at home. And the armies were transformed into a repressive police. The armies were transformed into an occupation army of their own territories. And so we had, in 1973, military coup in Chile, that same year in Uruguay, in 74 in Peru, in 76 in Argentina. So like a domino theory, but in the opposite sense, all of Latin America fell under the so-called national security regimes, one after the other. And that lasted for a whole decade. When finally, let's say a word of these national security regimes, Pinochet, Videla, and so on. Contrary to the extreme right that we see now emerging in Europe, which has a sense of nationalism and anti-globalization, that extreme right was very open to globalization. And its main program was privatize, liquidate the state role in the economy, open up to trade at the same time when any opposition was being cruelly repressed. And they established their own black international solidarity across continents with South Africa, with Taiwan. So we had permanent exchange of intelligence, of militaries, of different kinds of support of that Taiwan, South Africa, Latin American axis at that time and in that decade. And also with an active participation of this Korean Reverend Moon, Unification Church, and so on, that was very active there. Italian Mafia, Loggia P2, and so on, was also part of that whole equation. In the late 70s, early 80s, those regimes started to collapse, and democracy was gradually and slowly restored. But by the time that Latin America restored its democracy, Soviet Union was collapsing, and the Reagan-Thatcher axis was imposing to all of the world its formula, which was very clear: there is no alternative, TI&A. This is the end of history. You have to go the neoliberal way. There is nothing else in the world. And so those democracies went on that path, continued with structural adjustment, continued with the opening, and so on. There was an attempt, a strong attempt, to have the UN function as a counterweight to the neoliberal trend imposed by the Uruguay round, by the opening up, and so on. And that's what the cycle of UN conferences of the 90s, the Sustainable Development Conference, the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, the Social Summit in Copenhagen, and so on, when a new agenda was being designed, but with the economy going completely the other way. The result was the social collapse that Samir Amin already described. Interesting thing is that with functioning democracies, that social collapse found a new expression. And at the same time, the social movements started to identify with each other and started to look for precisely new alternatives. And in 2001, you had the first World Social Forum in Porto Alegre, which was supposed to be a gathering of some 3,000 activists under the slogan of "Another world is possible," which is the exact opposite of "there is no alternative." So it was stating another world is possible. And it was made to coincide with the World Economic Forum of Davos, with the basic message of when the big corporations and the oligarchs meet in Davos, in Switzerland, the peoples meet here in Porto Alegre. Now that was so extremely powerful, and it captured the imagination so much, that a gathering that was supposed to be of 3,000 activists, 20,000 showed up. And then the next year it was 100,000. And then, or simultaneously, in 1999, in Venezuela, a very obscure and unknown guy, former military, Hugo Chavez, gets elected. And then Lula gets elected in Brazil. And then, in a new kind of domino, you have, this is Porto Alegre, what it's calling, people on the streets saying, yes, another world is possible. And it resulted in this. So here you have on top the presidents of Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, and on the bottom the presidents of Argentina, Brazil, and Chile 2 decades before. Quite a change. Dilma took arms against those people, and she was imprisoned and tortured, the current president of Brazil. Michelle Bachelet, in the middle, is the daughter of a general that opposed Pinochet, was killed by Pinochet, and she and her mother were also imprisoned and tortured. Cristina Fernandez was in the student movement of that time. Our presidents in Uruguay were also in prison, and so on. And you have that again and again. So it's a complete reverse in the political scenario. And what these people did was very simple, was to say, hey, the people are poor, we need to assist them. And they started, because it was an emergency, to just give money to the people. And then they discovered that by giving money to the people, people started to buy things. And that was good for the economy. And then they discovered that if people are buying things, investors come and sell. And then you have more jobs. So we had last year we organized in Montevideo a meeting with our ministers and our president and so on, and they were saying traditionally the answer to crisis was cut salaries, reduce the unions, its power, cut the state expenditures. And that was the same as when in the Middle Ages a patient was sick and the doctors would say, open the veins and bleed them, so the sickness goes out. And you try that and said the patient is weaker than before. Well, bleed them more. They said, no, no, no. And they started to spend, and they started to protect the unions, and they started to pass more laws, increasing Social Security, increasing the rights of workers, of rural workers, domestic workers, and so on. And contrary to all the theory, investment grew in all those countries. So it's the absolute opposite of what the World Bank would tell you and what everybody else would tell you that has been tested in practice. And it works. Experience shows that it works. Now we have a challenge. Because now you have, let us wait for this a moment. What the Latin American countries did was to start to unite among themselves. They said the old alliance with the US, that has never provided any solution. And they created new organizations like UNASUR of all of the South American countries, CELAC of South America plus the Caribbean plus Central America and Mexico, meaning all of the Western Hemisphere except the US and Canada. They created the Banco del Sur as their own development bank, so as to gain some independence from the World Bank and the IMF. And in 2005, in Mar del Plata, they said to George Bush, we don't want a free trade area of the Americas. And a process of trying to establish a common market with the US was stopped by the presidents in 2005. So we come to the present situation where on the one hand we have the looming signs of a crisis, which we don't know, is it coming or not? Everybody's looking at China's growth rate and as if our life depended on it. Are the prices of commodities going to stay high? Is the currency policies of the Federal Reserve in the United States and the Central Bank in Europe going to keep the money flowing or not? There is a lot of uncertainties. And in that moment, President Obama comes in and says, okay, things have changed. That happened 2 weeks ago. This is also history in the making because for the first time in 50 years, a US president is shaking hands with Cuban president without any concession. So there was no concession whatsoever. It is just the admission of a policy that failed. And it was that the condition for a summit with the US and all of the region to happen. Because without that handshake, the summit would not have happened because the Latin American leaders would not go there. Does it mean that we are in a new era of Latin American-US relations? Well, we may be in a new era. We don't know what happens. But the other factor is that not a single resolution came out of that summit. It was a photo opportunity, yes, but not a single document comes out. Whereas 10 days before, in Costa Rica, CELAC had met 33 countries of the region, and they passed more than a dozen resolutions, including a resolution to continue and pursue a forum of those 33 countries and China, and to start a similar forum with India and one with Russia. I think this is important, this is systematic. I'm going to end here, but let me just make a quote of the final paragraph of Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, a book that describes the cycle of generations in imaginary town, Macondo, which is a kind of a symbol of all of Latin America. And that final paragraph has Aureliano, the character, reading an old manuscript which he managed to decipher, which contains the history of Macondo. And all the book, in a way, is trying to decipher the sense of that history. And then in that moment, Aureliano understood, when he was about to read the final line, that he would never leave the room, for it was foreseen that the city of mirrors, or mirage, would be wiped out by the wind, exiled from the memory of men at the precise moment when he would finish deciphering those old parchments, and that everything written on them was unrepeatable since time immemorial and forevermore, because races condemned to 100 years of solitude would not have a second opportunity on earth. So the book ends in that doom of solitude leading you to ultimate destruction. Is that our destiny, or is that a warning? I do not think that fate is written in some book everywhere. Maybe we can have some religious discussion around it, but I cannot believe on that. And I think that the solitude of Latin America will not last 100 years, and the way to avoid repeating the curse of history is precisely to reach out to Africa and Asia and build together our future. Thank you very much.